Do you really think I was giving up that soon? So I checked and I saw that I think it's been around 9 months since Count Dooku vs. Lumaya. Dang, I didn't think I was gone that long. But I'm sorry, but I do have a normal life outside YouTube and outside versus videos, so I had like a lot of life things. But I was able to manage some time to put the script together, record and edit and do all that stuff. But yeah, there are some things in this video that like are not there that most versus videos would have. That is solely to do with the timing of this video and me not being able to have enough time to add these things. Those being character biographies for both characters and the description of their lightsaber forms. So, if you've seen me, I'm a very small versus series YouTuber. I'm not big time. So, if you've seen me, you've likely seen people like Evanova95, Jen Soraya 1, Antoine Vandelay, Rob Terra, Forklifter Matt, etc., etc. And most of them have already used Exile Crash and TCW Maul. And why would you even click on this video if you don't know who Darth Maul is? So most of you should probably know who they are. And if you don't know, because I know Exile Crash, she's a little more obscure, just Google her. Just look her up. But I didn't have the time, and everyone knows who Darth Maul is anyway. And then for the description of their lightsaber forms, I do mention their forms and which ones they use, but I wasn't able to do a full-on description of their fighting style like I used to, because you guys have probably heard it about 10 trillion times, right? Like, every Versus series does it, so, and a lot of my older ones do have it as well, where I go into, like, the form's history and its movements. I do mention, I think, I do have stuff about, how this form benefited the fighting style, but I don't, have a full-on description, but I will explain which forms each character used. Without all that being said, grab a drink, sit back, relax, and I hope you enjoy. Maul was a Zabrak male, 36 years of age during the Siege of Mandalore, and remained in his physical prime. As the personal living weapon of Darth Sidious, he was put through the ultimate gauntlet of physical trials, ranging from being dunked underwater to being left on remote planets while being hunted by assassin droids, all of them molding him into the ideal specimen of physical power. Zabraks were known for their inherent endurance, as well as their 2 hearts, coupled with horns on their head which could be used as an extra weapon. Maul's physical strength was such that he killed an armed Yuzhang Vong warrior with his bare hands, as well as a steroid-enhanced Wampa by tearing out its ribcage, crushing its heart, as well as bashing its skull to the point of its face caving in on itself. All with his bare hands. Beyond that, he was capable of matching high-level Force wielders such as Qui-Gon Jinn and Savage Opress, who were both noted for their physical strength. His speed was just as impeccable. He could move faster than droids could perceive, and even match Darth Sidious for a time, a being so fast that he appeared to be fading in and out of existence by a distraught Anakin Skywalker. Maul's endurance and pain tolerance was on a whole nother level. He has resisted low-level Force lightning, freezing cold water, survived weeks of torture, and even being cut in half and left for dead for almost 12 years. After being recovered by his brother Savage Opress and brought into the galaxy once more, Maul received cybernetic legs, first by Mother Talzin and later the Death Watch Mandalorians. These legs increased his average physical strength, although remained about the same when Force augmentation came into play. Exile Kressh was a Sith pureblood, roughly in her early 30s. However, due to the inbreeding with her species and humans, her species' physical advantages were watered down significantly, and she was basically just a red-skinned human. Her primary physical traits were in her speed and dexterity, which were demonstrated by her one-handed use of the lightsaber and her constant acrobatics developed into her fighting style. Her endurance was also considerable, as shown when she tanked blaster fire from Tedeb Kel's servant Maggot and casually shrugged off an abdominal kick from Tedeb Kel. Ultimately, Kressh relied on her physical traits as they were, and ultimately focused her efforts on developing her Force abilities rather than her physical attributes. Do I really need to explain the victor here? Maul literally possesses every advantage in every single category and then some. And Exal has nothing that can compete with surviving after being cut in two. Maul gets the physical edge. Due to the fact that his master was still in the apprentice role of the Rule of Two when he found him, Maul spent most of his training as a Sith assassin and fighter rather than a Force wielder, which had him spending most of his time training through physical and lightsaber combat. Despite this, it ultimately allowed Maul to become an incredible fighter and one of the most skilled duelists of his era. As a lightsaber duelist, Darth Sidious instructed his apprentice in the highly difficult yet extremely deadly Form 7 of lightsaber combat, known as Juyo. However, due to the complexity of the style, it did require practice and skill in at least 1 to 2 other lightsaber forms, and Maul did just that, through his skill in the highly acrobatic Ataru form and the diverse Nyman style. His application of Ataru allowed him to employ his acrobatics in combat to greater effect, while also implementing hand-to-hand combat regularly into his sequences, while his use of Nyman helped him to develop with dual blade combat as well as skill in saber staff combat, also benefiting him with the implementation of Force-based attacks into his lightsaber sequences. Beyond that, Maul was also skilled in the Jar Kai dual blade fighting style, as well as the highly dangerous Teräs Käsi hand-to-hand fighting style, which he implemented into his lightsaber sequences regularly. In terms of his style's effectiveness, he has defeated notable figures such as Anun Bandara, Qui-Gon Jinn, Savage Opress, and TCW General Grievous in fair fights, and even without use of the Force, he defeated the highly skilled Pre Vizsla despite the Death Watch leader's multi-weapon fighting style and jetpack. He also defeated the ex-Jedi Padawan Ahsoka Tano despite being sleep-deprived and in a constant state of hysteria, as well as his insanity breaking out of control due to his knowledge of the fact that Sidious's ultimate plan was coming together, although he was captured due to being overconfident, as I mentioned, not thinking straight. In terms of weaknesses, his defenses were sometimes spotty, which allowed some opponents to land physical strikes against him, which was a weakness of both Juyo and Ataru. Maul almost always started on the offense, as was the same for most Juyo and Ataru specialists. He would deliver a violent assault of vicious attacks, as well as employing his Teräs Käsi training and Force integration through his lightsaber sequences, to ultimately batter and break his opponents further before moving in more. By the time of the Siege of Mandalore, Maul carried 2 weapons. The first being his rebuilt saber staff, which was made up of one half of his original double-bladed lightsaber and the other half a brand new hilt. The second was the rare and unique Dark Saber, which, while unique in comparison to other lightsabers, still possessed the benefits of an ordinary single-bladed lightsaber, plus looking super badass. Combining the two weapons allowed Maul a high level of variety, ranging from single saber combat, dual saber combat, and saber staff combat. Tactically, Maul had degraded somewhat since Naboo. As a Sith apprentice, he was more than capable of using good effectiveness of the environment to split his opponents up and slowly wither away their strength before finishing them. However, after his sanity tore apart after being cut in half, Maul wielded his fighting style more bluntly and head-on, channeling his physical combat and force integration more frequently and aggressively. On the whole, despite some minor shortcomings, Maul was still a lethal fighter and not one to mess around with. Exile Crass was first and foremost a force wielder, trained by a master who was first and foremost a force wielder, meaning that lightsaber combat was not her primary focus. Despite this, she did maintain a strong skill set when it came to her use of the blade. Kresh's use of the blade was defined by her dark side channeling, acrobatics, force integration, and her single-hand based blade work, which gives me the impression that she was a Form 7 Juyo specialist developed through Form 2 Makashi and Form 6 Nyman. She was a highly skilled aggressor, employing dynamic acrobatic attacks and stalwart shunts and blocks, backed up with a powerful use of force integration. However, for all her offensive output, her defenses were lacking, as shown by her being blindsided with Maggot's blaster file and the abdominal kick from Teneb Kel, and she was highly prone to tunnel vision. To make up for this, Exal doubled down on force integration, as well as developing tactical strategies to level out her opponents by ripping apart the environment where they fought and sending everything she could after them before striking herself. However, when being dropped into a fight cold, these tactics were unavailable and she found herself scrambling. Exile Crass carried a standard, nondescript lightsaber with a synthetic red crystal, which gave her weapon more cutting power at the expense of maneuverability. On the whole, while a force wielder at heart, she was certainly not a duelist to take lightly, and anyone who did could get into trouble very quickly. I find it interesting how similar of fighters these two are, despite their different training backgrounds. Both are Juyo specialists with other forms backing them up, both of them even using Nyman as one of them, and both have a slight disadvantage when on the defense. However, Kresh's lack of interest in her lightsaber skills has allowed her style to remain the same, while Maul has advanced his style with the use of Jarkai, Terraskasi, and saber staff combat. In terms of weaponry-based advantages, Maul gets the edge easily due to the amount of variety available to him. I know that some are going to be surprised that I'm giving him both his double-bladed lightsaber from Siege of Mandalore and the Darksaber, but to me it does make sense due to the fact that he was in possession of both weapons at the time. The Darksaber was just on another planet at that specific moment. Ultimately, I find Maul's more comprehensive, developed, and integrated fighting style more advanced than Kresh's, and his track record as a duelist backs up my opinion even further. Maul gets the edge as a lightsaber duelist and martial artist. As the Sith apprentice to Darth Sidious, Darth Maul was primarily trained in lightsaber combat and physical combat due to the fact that Sidious was training him as a mere assassin and was incapable of training a full-on Sith while his master Darth Plagueis was still around. However, following his defeat at the hands of Obi-Wan Kenobi on Naboo, Maul was forced to channel the dark side for decades until being recovered,
which resulted in a far more active use of its power from the renegade Sith. Maul retained his physical augmentation, coupled with an intense use of Dark Rage, the power that kept him alive on Lotho Minor for all those years. His telepathic skills seemingly advanced as well, as when he infiltrated the mind of clone trooper Jesse, and later received a Force vision showing the fall of the Jedi Order and the rise of Darth Vader, which points to a strong precognition on his part. Although Maul seemingly abandoned the Force Cloak ability, preferring a much more upfront presence, it is worth noting that for the majority of the Siege of Mandalore, ex-Padawan Ahsoka Tano was completely unable to sense him, only ever coming into contact with Maul on the Rogue Sith's terms. Where Maul advanced the most in regards to his Force abilities was his offensive application of telekinesis. Where his younger self would only employ such powers to affect the environment to better support his dueling skills, TCW Maul was far more blunt and overbearing with his powers. He has successfully breached the guards of General Grievous, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and Ahsoka Tano with the Force Push ability, and has used Force-based strangulation far more regularly to demonstrate his power over others as a fear tactic. Despite his more blunt uses of the Force, Maul's environmental awareness had not disappeared. During his escape of Obi-Wan Kenobi and Hondo Ohnaka on Florum, he telekinetically ripped a shuttle off a cliff and into their path, and later during his escape of Order 66, he tore apart steel walls of the Venator-class destroyer, using them both as offensive weapons and defensive shields. Something that I do not believe many people think about when discussing TCW Maul is his desire to showboat his power over those beneath him as a fear tactic. When the bounty hunter Sugi threw a knife towards him, he had his apprentice Savage halt the weapon mid-air to frighten all those in the area, and when acting on his own power, he telekinetically redirected Bo-Katan's blaster bolts before using force-based strangulation. Later, during Order 66, he channeled all his strength to rip apart the hyperdrive of the Venator, although I would not be remiss if I didn't remind everyone that he was being amped by the power of the dark side created by the death of so many Jedi. However, for all his growth as a Force wielder, Maul also digressed just as much. His defensive Force walls were little to none, and when faced against opponents equal or above his own power, he was easily ragdolled. He also lacked any knowledge of more advanced Sith abilities, such as sorcery or even Force lightning. And while he did have some ability to resist low levels of Force lightning, this was more due to his physical abilities rather than the Force. Maul also appeared to be somewhat underconfident in his own power when working alone during the Dark Times. While he did take Savage as an informal apprentice willingly, despite being very confident at the time, after Savage's death, he was very quick to attempt to turn Ahsoka to his side, and later during the reign of the Empire, the young Jedi Padawan Ezra Bridger, which may have been a lack of confidence in his own abilities, especially in comparison to his fellow Sith, notably his master. Ultimately, in regards to his Force powers, I would best describe Maul as a Sith juggernaut, unleashing his power with brute force and brute strength, while being more focused on physical and martial combat. TCW Maul was ultimately a trade-off. Although he gained far more raw power and offensive output, he lost any hope of matching the raw power of other Force wielders and failed to develop his abilities any further than a super high-level Dark Jedi. As a Force specialist first and foremost, and the apprentice of one of the most powerful Sith Lords in galactic history who shared her Force-based focus, it should come to no surprise that Exile Crass was a highly developed Force wielder, and a deadly force to be reckoned with. Her telekinesis was utterly ruthless and overbearing. She could rip apart stone pillars with simple pushes and shoves, throw around Force wielders under her own level, and has demonstrated use of the Force choke ability to strangle 3 targets at once while simultaneously pushing away 2 of them, demonstrating both raw power and skilled multitasking, while her defensive shields were capable of deflecting the barrage of crystalline permaglass shards hurled at her by Teneb Kel. In terms of her telepathy, while she doesn't have many showings, she was capable of resisting Emperor Vitiate's direct mind control over her, which is still extremely impressive, especially when we consider just how powerful Vitiate's mental control-based powers were. Kressh was also highly capable with Force Lightning, and its power was capable of killing targets and or leaving them with atrocious burns, and even on one occasion destroyed Teneb Kel's lightsaber purely with her own Force Lightning. She could wield the power through simple barrages or powerful storms. While just a personal theory on my part, I do believe that she had skill in Force Cloak due to the fact that she was able to keep away from Vitiate and the Dark Council for as long as she did. Ultimately, while Exal's power set was more closely resembling a Sith sorcerer, her tactics operated more like a Sith assassin, creating a massive opening between her and her opponents and ripping apart the environment to keep her opponents at bay while ambushing them with her force powers from afar. However, in a straight fight, she tended to simply wield her powers like a sledgehammer in conjunction with her lightsaber, and her mental insanity caused her to ultimately fail to unleash her full power when in a full-on lightsaber duel dropped in cold. This verdict is also somewhat obvious. To put it simply, Exile Crass is clearly more powerful and more developed in her abilities in comparison to Maul. Although Maul has shrugged off Force Lightning before, it was very low levels, and Exal's power was far beyond that one Night Sister. Their telekinetic applications appeared to be the same amount of power offensively. However, Maul's lacking defenses gives Kressh a very strong advantage, and Maul has nothing in comparison to Exal's feats of resisting Vitiate telepathically. Exile Crass gets the edge for Force abilities. Both Maul and Exile Crass were apprentices to arguably the 2 strongest Sith Lords in galactic history. They ultimately went rogue due to different circumstances and ultimately lost their sanity in the chaos of their lives, as they swore to get revenge on the masters who wronged them, but ultimately never getting the chance to truly shine. While Exal does have the superior Force abilities, which is a legitimate weakness for someone like Maul, her tactics and her application of such powers is ultimately focused on ambush and distraction, and in a straight fight, she digresses back to a standard blunt force use of her abilities. This digression plays into Maul's hands, who can match her offensive telekinesis with his own, his superior dueling skills, and his far more developed physical attributes puts Kressh in a difficult position where the only thing she has left is her Force Lightning, and honestly, I don't see that being the biggest problem for someone like Maul. In terms of how this fight would play out, I see it as a 7-10 advantage to the victor, and would play out very similar to Maul's fight with Pre Vizsla, with Maul standing in for himself and Vizsla being stood in for Exile Crass. The only difference is that all of Vizsla's gadgets would be replaced with Exal's Force abilities. The two would stand equally matched for a time, both throwing everything they had at the other, matching each other in skill, power, and physical attributes. Ultimately, Exal's straightforward tactics and her lack of creativity in a straight fight would be her undoing. Maul would begin to see patterns. His lightsaber skills would begin to overpower. His use of Teräs Käsi would keep Exal on her toes, and his use of Basically, his physical resistance would keep Exal's Force Lightning from being truly deadly. Ultimately, Maul would take his advantage and strike the killing blow. I declare TCW Maul the victor.
That was a pretty good video. So, thank you all for stopping by. I'm sorry it took me over 9 months to make another Versus video, but I did it. As you can tell by that time period, don't expect like a ton of Versus videos like all of a sudden. Like my schedule really hasn't stopped all that much, so my time for Versus videos is still pretty rare. I'm not giving up. I'm not quitting Versus series. I know I think we already lost like 3, I think. We don't have Rico Chico Maliko, Antoine Bandalay, or Grey Jedi anymore. So I'm not giving up. I'm not joining the quitter side. It's just that my videos are probably going to be a little more rare and not as frequent. But nevertheless, they can still happen. This was a video that I had been planning for a little while. Like, I was planning it around the same time as Dooku and Lumaya, or the idea for the video, and I never actually, it wasn't a video that I actually, was thinking, I thought it was going to come out way later. There were a few other matchups I was going to put above it, but due to scheduling stuff, and I'd already made the Force Abilities breakdown for Maul, and I'm like, you know what? Why not? Why not? I already have everything. I have everything. It'll be 30 minutes at most, and I think people will enjoy it, so I did it. I hope you all enjoyed. Let me know what you think. Do you think Maul takes this, or do you think Exile and her Force abilities are just enough to take Maul? Because it could go either way. But this isn't a stomp. It's a 7-10 advantage. It's not a stomp at all. But, yeah. This is Demon360 signing off. Peace.